Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you to the 12th edition of IIASA Voices. IIASA Voices is a webinar series organized by the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, IIASA. IIASA is an international research institute that uses systems analysis and policy-oriented research to address the global challenges of today. This includes challenges that are too large or too complex to be solved by a single country or academic discipline alone, such as climate change, the biodiversity and ecosystem crisis, or challenges related to inclusive socioeconomic development. To create a broad understanding of these global challenges, IIASA researchers partner with scientists, governments, and local organizations around the world to deliver policy-relevant scientific evidence. The IIASA Voices webinar series was created to serve as a platform, enabling exchanges between IIASA experts and the broader public, and to create a space for conversation. And I would like to thank you all for joining us today and for engaging in this exchange. Today's IIASA Voices webinar will focus on migration, and in particular on the relevance of new and emerging drivers of migration and their implications. My name is Roman Hoffmann. I'm the research group leader of IIASA's Migration and Sustainable Development Research Group, and I have the pleasure to moderate today's session. IIASA's Migration and Sustainable Development Research Group focuses on applying advanced data collection and estimation methods to quantify and better understand the trends, patterns, drivers, and consequences of different types of migration, considering its interactions with social, economic, and environmental factors. The group also uses projections to provide a forward-looking perspective on how different developments may shape migration in the future. Migration is a topic that is very present in today's public discourses and media. The prevailing narratives are often rather simplistic, suggesting that migration is mainly determined by economic push and pull factors. The reality, however, is more complex than that. Migration is to a large extent shaped by personal motives, aspirations, and capabilities. People migrate for various reasons, including to get an education, to follow family, a partner, or friends, to find a better job, or to discover new opportunities, cultures, and perspectives. Importantly, not everyone wishes to migrate or is able to do so, leading to most people remaining immobile for various reasons. Whether a person is able to migrate and decides to do so depends on a number of interrelated factors and drivers. Some of these drivers are beyond the personal locus of control of individuals or households and pertain to changes in local conditions such as economic crisis, political developments, or environmental factors. These include also impacts due to climate change and conflicts that can represent major threats to the stability, security, and well-being of communities, and can also affect human mobility patterns. In today's IIASA Voices webinar, we will focus on such evolving and disruptive drivers and the implications for human migration, as well as immobility. We will hear 3 short presentations given by distinguished IIASA scholars who will share their research and discuss policy strategies. The presentations will be followed by a Q&A session where you can ask questions which will be addressed by the speakers and then engage in an exchange and discussion with them. I would like to invite you all to post any questions that you have during the presentations into the chat so we can collect them and then address them later after the presentations. After the end of today's webinar, we will send around a short feedback survey, and we would be very grateful if you could take a few moments to fill it in. Without further ado, I would like to warmly welcome our first speaker today. It is my pleasure to introduce Raya Muttarak, who is the former director of IIASA's Population and Just Societies program and a member of IIASA's Migration and Sustainable Development Research Group. Raya is also a professor of demography at the Department of Statistical Sciences at the University of Bologna in Italy. Raya is a leading researcher in the field of environment population research and has done extensive work studying the impacts of climate change and conflict on migration. She is also the principal investigator of the European Research Council Consolidator Grant PopClima project, which aims to assess and forecast population dynamics under global climate change. Raya, we are very happy to have you with us today. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Roman, for the kind introduction. I'm going to share the screen, which we have already practiced doing that. And you should see my presentation now, I guess, yeah. So as Roman mentioned, that I would like to cover about the potentially kind of emerging important driver of migration. And one thing that I would like to focus in my talk today is water, because we know how fundamental water is for probably the most important or the second most important after oxygen, the air that we need to breathe, the water. We need, human being need water to survive. So the question would be, if we have scarcity or we have the climate change may induce the reduction in water availability with higher population or different demand of water may reduce the water that we have, right? So what would happen? Because we need water to survive. Maybe I just quote some of the statistics that I find quite worrying. So the UN Water, the latest report back in 2023, last year, they estimated that as many as...
Excuse me, Raya, we cannot see your screen. I'm not sure something...
You cannot see my screen. Yeah, thanks a lot for letting me know. We said we practiced that, and then I still don't... Okay, I didn't share them. Okay, yeah, the only thing is I didn't share. Now no, you don't see it, huh?
No, still not. Yeah, now we see it, yes.
And it's in the presentation mode.
That's right, yes.
But you didn't miss much. It's just the same graph. I keep on talking, so I didn't. So, but this is precisely I'm about to talk about this. So as many as 2 billion people in the world, so about 26% of the global population, do not have access to safe drinking water. So that's quite a worrying number, actually. And if we talk about access to water, it's also important for sanitation. It's almost half of the world population, 3.5 billion, do not have access to sanitation. And the question would be, if climate change or other drivers changes the availability of water, what would happen, right? And then this graph that I would like to show also represent the unequal distribution in terms of availability of water. If you look at the indicator of water stress, which is the proportion of available freshwater resources to the water withdrawal. So the red, the orange color show how some areas in the world are really reaching the critical level of water stress. And as we pretty much imagine, like countries in the Middle East, Northern Africa, but also South Asian countries as well. So the question would be, can this water stress, or would this stress in water level drive migration? Of course, water system and human system are extremely complex, hence system analysis. And it can go in many different mechanisms or interrelationship between different factors and drivers that may affect migration. So imagine in the beginning that we have changes in water availability, or it can be due to climate change, it can be due to change in water demand because of industrialization, because of higher population, we need more water for agriculture and so on. But also climate change can bring extreme events like hazard, floods, or droughts also affect water, right? Also, or affect our livelihoods. So when So there's a series of consequences. So if water availability changes or extreme events happen, then it may lead to a decline in agriculture production. It may affect the soil degradation, erosion, destroying infrastructure, and that affects the livelihoods. So it affects how we generate income. It can affect food security. And through this relationship, households may need to think of, do they migrate or do they stay? Roman already mentioned that when we talk about drivers of migration, another side is also people may want to migrate but cannot migrate. And that's also quite important. It can be linked also to water on this side. But we also know, I mean, our group study a lot about migration, as you can see from this graph. I'm not going into detail. So individual factors, economic opportunities also affect migration. So several factors, as we know, we have studied migration. We, as in social scientists, have studied migration for a long time. Individual factors are probably one of the best factor that explain migration. We know quite well age, for instance. Younger people are more likely to migrate. Education plays a role, gender, marital status to a certain extent. But still, we have some evidence that's showing that compared to all of these individual characteristics, so this is the analysis that we did for 64 countries, looking at how important different drivers are to explain migration, internal migration in this particular case. Still, we can find that the dot that you're seeing in this graph represent different countries that we have. So in some countries, actually the importance of rainfall shock, so when the region experiences the variation in rainfall patterns, it still can have quite a strong expanded power as much as general education in certain regions. So it does play a role. So we have some evidence on that. And I want to dig a bit further into the indicator that recently we started using is a work also with Roman, that look at desertification or acidification. So it's sort of slightly go beyond just measuring rainfall, because as we know, maybe the same land, the same region experience, the different region experience the same amount of rainfall. It doesn't mean that you have exactly the same availability of groundwater that the place can reserve, right? Because it depends on the soil moisture, the evapotranspiration. So we thought, instead of using just rainfall, why not using the type of indicator that also capture such complex relationship, like how much the water evaporate out from the air, how much the soil can hold the water. And this is the indicator called aridity index. And also I would say that this graph or this map, it's also quite, I would say quite worrying again, because the world is actually, the projections show that different areas in the world, but in general, the trend would be the world would become more arid. So it's going to be more dry and drier. They also, so this particular study also showed that, so by the year 2040, if the world is getting drier, it would affect crop production. And if you look at these 4 crops that I kind of highlight, these are 4 major crops that are fundamental for most people in the world, so maize, rice, soybeans, and wheat. With the increase in aridity, the yields of these crops would reduce. So that's also quite worrying. So we know that aridification would lead to a reduction in agriculture production of major food that people need, right? So food security. So the next question would be, so if these things happen, what do people do? People who live in this red, this yellow area, what would they do if you face food insecurity? So what we did is we match all of these aridity index with the next data sources, which is, of course, unfortunately, but it's not too bad. I would say we can't cover the whole world. We don't have migration data for the whole world. It's not too bad to cover at least 72 countries. So the area in the blue, these are the areas that we have information. We know about the internal migration pattern. I just emphasize that I'm talking about internal migration. So say if I point to India, I'm not sure if you see my mouth, but anyway, it's about people from one state in India moving to another. So that's how we capture internal migration. We have 72 countries. It runs across almost a 60 years period from 1960. So it's quite a powerful also data. And we see if aridification, because we see that it has changed, and if these changes in aridification in different of these subnational area has some relationship with internal migration or not. And we did find something. Actually, as you can see, if you see the the line that go across the vertical line, and whatever line that you see, the green line that is go towards the right, it means migration increase. So we observe the higher flows in migration, and it varies across region, but what we seeing, so we use different indicator, but I want to emphasize a bit more on the aridity index, or SPI, which is the measurement of drought in the past, accumulating in the past 3 months or the past 48 months, but pretty much it shows more or less, I would say, quite consistent patterns. So places like Africa, Middle East, South Asia, Southern Europe, in particular, if they experience drought or if the area become more arid, we would observe high migration in this area. And this heterogeneity, we can also explain, depends on the characteristics of the area that we look at. And for instance, the higher migration we would observe when the area experience aridification would be more in the wealthier countries. So this is GDP level of the countries, and not surprisingly, or not surprising pattern would be the areas that depend a lot on agriculture. If they experience aridity, they get exposed to drought, then we would see also migration gets higher in these areas. So this kind of heterogeneity, I think it's important to note. And this would be my last thing that I want to share. In the next slide, I showed differentiation or variation by geographical characteristics, but we can dig further, because I think this point is important also, that as I mentioned earlier, some people may need to migrate. Okay, you live in the area that you experience maybe drought, maybe aridity, you may need to migrate, but not everyone would move. And it's quite this variation, we don't pick up the differences between men and women, but the variation by the level of education is I would say, from the social scientist point, it's quite interesting, but it's also, you may think that it's also reflect maybe inequality also here, particularly in less developed countries. So what we're seeing here, people with low level of education, so with less than primary level of education, when they experience drought, or when they experience aridification, they don't move. We may think that they may want to move, but they cannot move. That's one of the explanation. But also those who are tertiary education, but this is probably the opposite explanation, right? So if you kind of have university degree, your life may not depend at all on agriculture, or you may be able to adapt. So you also don't move, but probably you have high adaptive capacity. So it does with around secondary level of education will be more sensitive. And I think I'm going to stop here before passing to Jesus. And I want to emphasize that this variation that we see, maybe by education, by wealth, by different regions, may explain also how much of people would have access to the resources, or maybe they cannot move if they want to. And these differentials, right, so can lead also to conflict in terms of resources access. And I'm going to stop here and pass on to Jesus.
Yeah, thank you very much, Raya, for this insightful presentation showing how water stress can affect populations in different parts of the world, and how this can also influence mobility patterns. To the audience, just wanted to remind you that if you have any questions for Raya, you can post them in the chat. I will then later read the questions to the speakers, so they can answer to them one by one and provide further insights on the open questions that you may have. It is my pleasure to introduce now our next speaker to you, Jesus Crespo Cuaresma. He's a research scholar also at the Migration and Sustainable Development Research Group at IIASA, and he's also a full professor at the Department of Economics at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. He's working on applied macroeconometrics, among others, with a focus on population and migration research, and has contributed to advancing econometric and forecasting methods to study migration worldwide. He has published numerous articles in renowned scientific journals and has acted as a scientific consultant, among others, to the World Bank, the Austrian Institute of Economic Research, and the Austrian National Bank. Jesus, thank you very much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. The pleasure is mine to be here. Let me share my screen. Let's see if this works better than with Raya. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Excellent. So let me just make it a bit bigger. And actually, let me tell you a little bit about one of the factors that may explain the heterogeneity that Raya was referring to when it comes to the link between environmental shocks, and in particular drought shocks, and migration responses. And one of the factors that might explain and that might modulate precisely this link is actually one that probably to the whole audience right now appears pretty evident. And it appears pretty evident because media and public discussion have commented on this mechanism very often, as you can see in my screen, with a whole lot of media reports on the fact that maybe environmental shocks cause migration through a particular channel, which would be the channel of creating more conflict worldwide, and that part of the migration that we would observe would come from climate shock-based conflict and war happening in parts of the world. That intuition, that suggestion actually had not until recently been empirically studied in a rigorous manner. Actually, in a very recent study that both Roman, Raya, and myself, with other co-authors, published in Nature Climate Change, we did a meta-analysis where we had a look at over 1,800 estimates of the effect of climate shocks on migration after we standardized all of those effects that have been found in the literature. And we found out that, among many other things, that the effects of environmental shocks actually on migration depend on whether conflict is accounted for in the empirical analysis that led to those results. And that conflict, therefore, appears at the same time as a moderator, that means it explains the process through which climatic shocks and migration flows are related, and as a mediator, meaning that it also affects the strength and direction of the relationship between those two variables, namely climatic shocks and migration flows. Let me delve a little bit deeper into this particular mechanism. In some work that actually Raya and myself with other co-authors worked on a couple of years ago, we tried to understand the link between climatic shocks, and in particular droughts, and forced migration, refugee migration, in much more detail. So we basically made use of the data that you can see in your screen right now. These are data on asylum seeking, bilateral migration flow. That means we know which asylum seekers were asking for asylum in which country and where did they come from. The data that you see in there are the averages of two periods, 2006 to 2010 on your left-hand side, and 2011 to 2015 on the right-hand side. And you can notice that there's quite a lot of variation in asylum-seeking flows across countries of the world, both across countries and over time. As you can see, most of the asylum-seeking flows that took place in the period 2006 and to 2010 were mostly between Western and Southern Asian countries and Southern and Western Europe, even when there was a whole lot of other intercontinental asylum-seeking activity, while actually as we moved to 2011-2015, the nature of those flows over time also changes strongly. So as you can see, it was mostly within the African continent those migration flows took place in the second part of that period. So what we did is we tried to explain those differences that we observe across countries in asylum seeking, across pairs of countries, and their evolution over time using an econometric model where we tried to causally link drought shocks to the existence of asylum seeking activities. For that, we constructed this statistical model that explained the variation that you can observe in that screen at the country pair level. And we linked that to the existence of drought in the origin country of the asylum seekers. The results of that analysis that was published some years ago in a paper that came out in Global Environmental Change, we discovered actually that the effect of droughts on the likelihood of conflict and thus asylum seeking is also very heterogeneous and context specific, and it tends to be time varying. So it was actually more present in the first part of that analysis, which, if you remember, was very much dominated by the context of flows of Syrian refugees to Western Europe after the Syrian war, but also very much related to the aftermath of the Arab Spring that also led to some asylum seeking. And it tends to be higher, that effect, in countries that are undergoing a political transformation. That means those countries that are not pure democracies or pure autocracies, but that are in the spectrum in between. At the same time, of course, there's a persistence in conflict, meaning that also drought shocks can lead to a higher likelihood of conflict and therefore a higher likelihood of asylum-seeking activities in countries that have already experienced conflict in the recent past. The model that we have can be also used for policy and for monitoring, and on top of that also as an early warning mechanism, because we can assign now the probability to each country that a given drought shock leads to that chain of events that would end up creating conflict and afterwards creating asylum seeking. What you see there in the screen is actually a categorization of countries by actually the probability that a given drought shock leads to this mechanism through which conflict leads then to forced migration. You can see that there's also, for the case of the African continent, quite a lot of heterogeneity in the sensitivity of countries when it comes to the reaction of in the form of conflict and asylum seeking to drought shocks, with, for example, Libya, Syria, and Mozambique being countries with a relatively high estimate of such a likelihood, followed by countries such as Niger, Mauritania, or Zimbabwe. If we go to the other part of the world where the highest likelihood of such mechanisms can be found, namely the Latin America, we also find that, for example, Brazil and Honduras are usual examples or examples of countries where the estimate of this effect is particularly large. But also in Mexico and Colombia, for example, the likelihood of drought shocks leading to conflict. Conflict is defined here as a violent conflict that would lead at least to 25 casualties or battle casualties. Those countries are the ones that experience the highest likelihood. Actually, for the case of Colombia, since this study was based on international flows of asylum seekers, for the case of Colombia, we also were in the favorable position of having very granular data for a period of time, namely 2000 to 2005, data on migration flows within the countries in municipalities of relatively small size. So we could actually repeat this study, having a look at the effect that drought shocks have on conflict and migration at the internal migration level instead of at this international asylum seeking level of coarseness or granularity. And for the case of Colombia, we found actually that the effect of drought on conflict and on subsequent, in this case, internal migration is actually larger for internal migration than what we found for international migration flows. And it tends to be larger also for relatively small conflicts, namely those that come together with less than 10 casualties. On top of that, it's also larger in areas that have not experienced another conflict in period years, so it tends to be a first trigger for conflict. And we also found that a high share of mining in total GDP appears to be positively correlated with the probability of such a conflict happening, which suggests that some violent episodes that are created by drought in Colombia might involve competition for resources at the subnational level, which also links to some of the results that Raya presented before in terms of aridification differences that you observe within countries. Actually, the fact that the access to other income sources different from agriculture tends to be an important moderator effect for the role that conflict plays as a driver of migration. We also found, when we had a look at more granular data, actually grid level data at 50 times 50 kilometers grids for Africa, in a recent study that we published in Nature Communications, where we mapped the effect of drought shocks on human mobility at the grid cell level. And we actually found out that the average effect of a drought shock implies, again, an increase in internal migration, such as the one that we found for the case of conflict as a mediator in Colombia, and that effect increases with the severity and duration of the drought episode. And again, it tends to be moderated by the existence and the availability of mineral resources as an alternative income source on top of agricultural practices. And with this, I finish and pass over to Roman, which I think will pass over to Gregor, that will tell us even more about the topic. Thanks a lot for your attention.
That's right. Thank you very much, Jesus, for sharing all these interesting insights from your work, and also for illustrating these multiple interlinkages between conflict, environmental processes, and hazards, and migration and displacement outcomes. And thank you also to the audience for posting your interesting questions into the chat. If you have any questions to Jesus, please use the chat to ask them there. I will then later read them to Jesus and the other speakers. Now I would like to give the floor to our last speaker for today, Gregor Zens. He's also a research scholar in IIASA's Migration and Sustainable Development Group, which he joined in 2023. He previously held academic positions at the Bocconi Institute for Data Science and Analytics in Milan and the Institute for Statistics and Mathematics at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. Furthermore, he has acted as a scientific consultant for the World Bank Group. His research interests include developing statistical methods and empirical models to analyze social science phenomena with focus on questions related to human development and mobility. And Gregor will present outcomes from a case study on the linkages between conflict and displacement in Somalia. Please, Gregor, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this introduction, Roman. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Thanks. So Jesus already talked a little bit about the linkages between environment, conflict, and migration. And what I will do for the remainder of this webinar is I will zoom into the specific dynamics that conflict and human migration have on a very disaggregated level. So we are now going to look into district levels and very short timeframes to see how this plays out. And I will mainly talk about forced migration or forced displacement, which is just a technical term to refer to when people have to leave their homes due to some negative shocks, which are very often conflict or some conflict-related events. And this is a global crisis currently, so we have already talked about this, but to give you some sense of numbers, the United Nations estimate that we have more than 100 million people that currently live in displacement. And as we have heard, the majority of those is displaced somehow due to conflict and conflict-related events. And what we tried to uncover in some recent research is how does this play out on a very detailed level? So how long does it take for people to get displaced? What drives the strength of the displacement response? Which populations are more resilient than others? These kind of questions. And this is not only to simply deepen the scientific understanding that we have on the interactions of conflict and displacement, but there's of course always the hope that a better understanding of human mobility and better models of human mobility and displacement can somehow inform policy and provide us with better responses to displacement in conflict settings. So what I will present is essentially a brief overview of a recent project that I did together with Lisa Thalheimer from the United Nations University. And as Roman already anticipated, I will talk about a specific case study. And this case study country will be Somalia in Eastern Africa, which unfortunately is a prime case study country when you want to study conflict and displacement, as it had a very long history of violent conflict. It is in an ongoing state of civil war since the late 1980s, which together with reoccurring extreme weather events and natural disasters, such as floods and droughts, has led to mass displacement of the Somalian population. So the best estimates that we have tell us that around a fifth of the population of Somalia are currently displaced, the majority being displaced inside the country borders, but Somalia has also one of the largest international diasporas in the world. And what we try to understand in this research is essentially how single impacts of conflict, single events of conflict impact human mobility. And we can see here on the right side of this slide the aftermath of one of these events, where you can see that a single bombing event can have quite a lot of destructive power and can lead to the destruction of livelihoods and the destruction of apartments, which then pushes people into displacement and into forced migration. And this is what we try to capture and what we try to connect to with our research. So what we use is a very nice and unique data set that the United Nations collect in Somalia, where they essentially run a monitoring network that tells us for each of the 74 districts of Somalia that you can see on the right side of the slide. They collect data on human mobility in each of those 74 districts, and they collect this for each week. So as you can imagine, we have a very, very granular perspective here. We have weekly displacement flows on a very small geographical level, and this allows us to study in detail how human populations move in times of conflict. We then take this data and connect it to data on conflict events, which you can see here on this slide. So there is a very commonly used database called ACLED, and they report single events of conflict. And on this map here on the right side, every single point is one conflict event. You can see that we know where these conflict events happened, and we also know when these conflict events happened. So we can connect every single of these conflict events to the displacement data that we had, and then analyze, well, what is the relationship of these conflict events and human displacement that occurs after these conflict events. We also have several types of conflict events, and as you're going to see, it really depends on what kind of conflict events happens, because a single bombing event, as we have seen before, has very different impacts than, for instance, strategic developments or structural developments, where the balance of power shifts within a conflict. So one example would be when a given conflict party takes over control over a piece of land that they did not control before. So as we're going to see, this has quite large impacts on displacement flows. What we then do is we take this displacement data, we connect it and match it to this conflict data and send it through a statistical model that we develop. And I'm not going to give you a lot of details on our results, but the two most substantive findings are maybe the first one, not that surprisingly, but the displacement response is usually very, very, very fast. So what happens is that people more or less move immediately after conflict events. So this is forced migration. This is more or less involuntary migration. If you experience a conflict event, then you can see that displacement increases fast. However, these dynamics depend on the type of conflict event. So while for most type of events, we see that the conflict response happens within a few days or weeks, for these structural developments where land is transferred in terms of political power, for instance, we find that the effects are much stronger and much longer lasting. So on average, a single structural change or strategic development type of event has effects up to, let's say, 1.5 or 2 months. And now the question is like, what can we learn from this case study, and how can we generalize those findings, and how can we connect this back together with what Jesus and Raya have said? Well, the broader insights from this study are, first, that if we want to have a detailed understanding of human migration and conflict, then first we need to dissect what we actually mean with conflict. So the term conflict is relatively broad and can imply very different things that can impact human migration very differently. And the second insight is that, well, human displacement as a response to conflict is very, very, very fast, which unfortunately puts us researchers into a very challenging position, because usually there is not very good and very high quality data if we want to study human migration on a disaggregated level and at short periods of time. So there is a clear need to produce better data, but not only on human migration and displacement, but also about environmental factors that could cause human migration or could cause displacement, where we have access to some data, but the better data for the future would be data that covers very short time periods and a very high spatial resolution. If we gain access to this data, then this will open up some future research opportunities that will bring us back to the first two talks of this webinar, and hopefully will allow us to better understand not only how conflict and migration are connected, but also how this relationship is affected by environmental degradation and by climate change. And I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any comments or questions. So Roman, back to you.
Thank you very much, Gregor, for sharing these exciting results from your recent work. I would also like to mention that this study on Somalia was very recently published as a IIASA working paper, which you can find on the website of the Migration and Sustainable Development Group. Thank you all to our speakers for providing these comprehensive overviews on the topic, which showed not only how different drivers influence migration patterns, but also how these drivers are interacting with each other in complex ways and how they can produce very different outcomes in different contexts. I think the presentations have also illustrated very nicely the different ways how we as researchers approach the topic of migration, and how we, through different means of different data sets and methods, try to study mobility outcomes in different contexts, ranging from more micro-level studies to more macro-level studies, and considering a broad set of different influences and factors. We have received a number of questions in the chat, and I would like to pass some of the questions on to our speakers to engage for the remaining 20 minutes or so in an exchange and discussion around some of the results that you just presented to us. A first question I would like to ask to Raya. It was asked several times in the chat, the differences between rural areas and urban areas in the way how they are affected by climatic stresses, and how this can produce very different mobility responses in these different contexts. Could you comment a bit more on that, and what your research has shown, how different areas worldwide are differently affected and why? Thanks.
Yeah, so I think at least from the one that we look at is the effect is stronger in the areas that depend on agriculture, which means the rural areas would be more sensitive, as you would imagine, if you rely on rainfall or on the water resource for your livelihood, then it would be more important there. At the same time, the urban area would be it's interacting with income, of course, would be the richer area. So that would be the area that people would want to move to. So we found some of these relationships there.
Okay, thank you. Then I have a question for Jesus by Susana Adamo. Thank you very much for this question. So first, if I understood correctly, you mentioned that diversified sources of income could modify the link between drought, conflict, and migration. And could you elaborate a bit more on this? And then we have a related question, maybe you can answer them together. You mentioned that conflict can be understood as both a mediator and a moderator of the effect of climate change on migration. And the question is whether you are also aware of any evidence of climate change being a moderator of the effect of conflict on migration. So through this kind of channel in the nexus. And for example, that could be for areas that have been exposed to conflict for a long time for reasons unrelated to climate change. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much for the questions. Actually, we could speak about this for hours, because there are many interesting relationships that you are speaking to. So let me start by talking about how income diversification affects the link between environmental shocks, conflict, and migration in this kind of trinity. So I can only relate to the work that we have been doing for the case of Colombia. And we know that these type of links are very country and context specific. So I can only refer to the results that we found for Colombia. In the case of Colombia, we found that independently of environmental shocks, that means independently of the occurrence of drought, the municipalities in parts of the country that had a higher share of mining, meaning some kind of more diversified type of income sources beyond agriculture in rural areas, they were more likely to actually experience conflict at all, independently of the drought. And the drought would just increase that probability even further, pushing it up. We actually interpret such a result for the data we have. We cannot say much more than that. Relating it also to the existing literature as basically the fact that competition for resources in a context of political instability and latent conflict actually can increase the likelihood of conflict, and that's it. Now, in our study for Africa, where we have a look at a much finer grid level data set, but we don't focus on conflict, but just on any type of mechanism leading from environmental shocks to migration, what we find is that parts of the country where mining sites and access to mineral resources are available, you will tend to find a smaller effect of environmental shocks on migration, independently of whether conflict plays a role or not, implying that probably the loss of crop productivity would be less of a push factor in environments where other type of income sources are available. On climate change, I mean, I was very careful not to talk about climate change shocks or climate change as such, but just to talk about environmental shocks, because it is the role of sub-discipline within climate research, namely climate change attribution, to actually tell us whether those shocks that we observe would have otherwise occurred without climate change. That means we are just having a look at observations of drought without necessarily being able to link it to the fact that they're causally linked to climate change. In any case, to the extent that climate change will actually increase such type of environmental shocks, it is indeed the case that just the likelihood of conflict and its consequences in terms of human mobility will indeed increase over time. But again, I don't want to give all of the weight to trends that have to do with climate change. It might be the case that certain drought shocks would have happened also without the increase in emissions that we have observed over the last centuries.
Yeah, thank you, Jesus, and also for clarifying that it is important to kind of really not over-attribute to the single drivers and causes that we're looking at. The migration moves that we see to not create a too simplistic and deterministic notion of what the actual drivers are. As we also mentioned at the beginning, migration is really the outcome of complex processes that connect, let's say, drivers at the individual household, community, and then beyond levels. So thanks for raising that. We received also a question for Gregor. If you could elaborate a bit more on the methodology that you use, Gregor, in your study, also the data set that you used. And I would also be interested, if I may ask the question, if there is an interest from the policy side in using these insights that you have generated for basically informing, for example, their interventions in this area or beyond Somalia when it comes to conflict-driven displacement. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for this. So on the data, which will naturally lead to the method, the data is collected by the United Nations, who run a monitoring network in Somalia. And how this works in practice is that they have, at strategic points throughout Somalia, some surveyors and monitors that just write manual lists of how many people are passing through. So even though our data is very detailed and very fine-grained and very nice to analyze human displacement, it comes with a lot of issues just due to the fact how it is collected. So there is missing data for some time periods where they did not have enough stuff to cover certain regions. Then it's very hard, if there is 50,000 people coming through, to accurately say whether those are 30,000, 50,000, or 70,000 in a short period of time. So the data is noisy, it has missingness, and for that reason, we develop a specific statistical model that tries to take all of these issues into account. It is more or less a very fancy version of a panel regression model, and feel free to look into the working paper to find all of the details. And in terms of the policy insights of the paper, I mean, there is two ways on how you can use these results. So just by using our estimates directly or results directly, they very much underscore that one of the main response strategies are so-called rapid response teams. So teams that you can send into affected regions extremely fast, because as I said, it's about days and weeks, and people do not wait for a month after a conflict event that they experience before migrating. And the other thing is that you could use the model directly for forecasting purposes. So it works relatively well in that respect. And if you're interested in just producing displacement forecasts, given the situation today, then this is also a possibility on how you can use this model that we developed.
Thank you, Gregor. I would like to come back to you, Raya. A question generally from all the research that you've been doing. We see often in public discourses in media that really climate change is kind of considered as being like the main driving force of migration in the future, or generally like environmental processes as a very important driver. And can you speak a bit about how environmental factors come into play and how they influence migration against the background of other drivers, and how these can also be related to each other?
Yeah, so I think as we show, right, so we may sometimes have a really direct effect. So imagine if we talk about like regular cases like displacement, for instance, environmental hazard like hurricanes or floods, which would really drive, you have to get displaced because you cannot live in that place. So you may see this is direct, but otherwise it would interplay with different factors. And I think the work that Jesus was presenting, it's really showing that different shocks or different things are happening, and that's the external one. But we also have to consider also the individual one, right? So because first of all, regardless of climate, regardless of conflict, if you're unemployed, you probably already consider of moving, and all these external shocks just kind of adding up into the challenges that people face. So I think the kind of the frontier work now that you, Roman, in the IIASA group is trying to do in general is to try to capture as many as different drivers that we can and look at the interaction between them. And this is challenging apart from the data side, but I think from the modeling side, it's also quite complex, which in a sense need the expertise of Jesus and Gregor and many others to help in that modeling thing as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Raya. And Jesus, I know that you have also been involved looking not only at the drivers of migration, but also looking at implications of mobility and migration, also looking at implications for labor markets, for example. You've been involved in a major book writing effort looking at like what implications are of migration for migration to Austria, also highlighting that often the narratives are maybe more alarmistic than what we can expect realistically from the research that we are doing. I wanted to ask if you could comment a bit more on that, and maybe also think about what could be helpful strategies and also like ways in promoting research to basically change maybe the narratives around migration that we're seeing in many public fora, and how we as researchers can also contribute to these debates in a proactive way. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, well, some of the narratives are too alarmistic, some of them are too little alarmistic. So that, I mean, when it comes to Austria as a typical example of Western European advanced economy, and when it comes to Austria also as a typical example of an aging society, And given the potential challenges that come together in terms of future economic growth, in terms of future sustainability of public finance, I mean, the fact that migration has to be as part of the solution on top of the table, it's relatively straightforward. Then the question is, how do you actually create a market in which the supply and demand of skills globally can be actually met in a way in which it is a win-win situation for each pair of countries in the world, so to speak. And there, of course, there are a whole lot of question marks in terms of how to improve and design a policy that can account for the challenges of aging populations. I mean, I believe in the case of Austria, and I think that speaks for the whole of Central Europe, without thinking a little bit deeper into the human capital side of it and into the how can education in the country and the education institutions in the country actually act as a synergy to incoming migrants to, on the one hand, provide them with skills, on the other hand, also not to leave them behind in the educational system. That's somewhere where Austria still has quite a lot to do. And I'm thinking about things like the fact that Austria has got a very early tracking system when it comes to pupils in schools. People are selected basically to vocational training very, very early in their lives. And that could be something where certain imperfections take place that would also have effects on the potential of the skills of migrants to be used in the country. That is one hand, and on the other hand is basically improving information when it comes to the demand for skills that advanced economies in general have. So there are already certain projects going on at the European level where basically working on the origin country, you would already create projects where firms in say, Europe would already train potential migrants and origin country individuals to ease their transition to the labor market in Europe. I think that there are quite some initiatives going on at the moment that probably would need to be enlarged and improved, but where things could actually work out indeed as a win-win situation for both world regions.
Thank you. Gregor, I have a short question for you for the last 2 minutes that remain. Just briefly, if you could, because you're working a lot with data and also like high resolution data sets, including on one side migration, conflict, but then also integrating environmental dimensions into your work. I'd be interested, where do you see, let's say, the literature, the research moving to in terms of improved data access, or what gets you excited, and what kind of data and what do you hope for when it comes to data access that would allow us to better study these processes that we were talking about today?
Well, what I think is going to be the most realistic, cool new data that we can work with in the next few years, it's probably going to be better environmental data, simply because there is a lot of studies done on like global modeling of phenomena like flood, or like what Raya has been showing on water access and water stress. So this is going to allow for much more granular analysis of how human migration responds to environmental factors. I doubt that there is going to be much better data on human mobility in conflict zones in the next few years, especially for the most affected, so internally displaced persons, because as long as you do not cross an international border, it's very unlikely that you're going to be registered by any registration system, unless you have something like Somalia has, which is a countrywide monitoring system, but that is more or less the exception.
Thank you. Yes, I agree. There's, especially with the environmental data, we see a lot of developments happening. Let's hope that maybe also in some of the other domains that we're focusing on in our work, we will see equal developments that may maybe allow us also to address some of these questions more rigorously, although, as you mentioned, some challenges remain with, for example, tracking and recording of migration movements within countries. With this, I would like to slowly come to an end. I would like to thank again all our speakers joining us today for their excellent presentations and for providing all the insights. I would also like to thank the audience for your presence here today. We hope that you found the discussions engaging and informative, and we really appreciate all the questions submitted and the exchange that we had, which I think was very interesting. And if there were any questions that were not yet answered, we will try to basically provide answers to you in a written format, so that you have really the full information that you were needing to fully comprehend the topic and get additional insights. Also, a recording of this webinar will be accessible on the IIASA website and on our YouTube channel. And additionally, we will provide links to all the resources mentioned during the presentations after the webinar, as I said, so you have the full set of information that also related to any materials that we were speaking about. This was now the first webinar for 2024, and we're looking forward to seeing you for our next IIASA Voices event, which is currently being planned. And for updates, please follow us on our social media channels and other means of communication to stay updated. And finally, as I mentioned, also your feedback is very important for us for enhancing our future events. So we would like to kindly ask you to take a moment to participate in a post-meeting survey, which will appear in your browser after you exit this session. This will be very helpful for us to basically gather insights about what you liked, what you didn't like about the seminar, and having continuous improvements for the upcoming events. And of course, all answers will be fully anonymized, so your anonymity would be guaranteed. And with this, I would like to thank you all again and end our IIASA Voices webinar on migration. Thank you all and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everybody.
Now we are out? No.